Welcome to the Signature Books Podcast. I'm Devery Anderson, and I am the marketing manager here at Signature Books. And today, my guest is Robert A. Rees. And Bob is a former editor of Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. He edited the journal from 1970 to 1976. And he's edited or co-edited some books with Signature. And one of those is Why I Stay, and another is Why I Stay Too. And uh, both of these carry the subtitle, The Challenges of Discipleship for Contemporary Mormons. We'll be discussing these somewhat today. He's also the editor of Proving Contraries, a collection of writings in honor of Eugene England. And with Eugene England, he is a co-editor of the Reader's Book of Mormon. And again, all of these are published by Signature Books. And he's also the author of A New Witness to the World, Reading and Rereading the Book of Mormon, which he published through BCC Press. And he was the director of the Mormon Studies program at GTU, the Graduate Theological Union, and he held that position for several years. And he also taught at UCLA, UC Santa Cruz, and UC Berkeley. And he was a Fulbright professor of American Studies in the Baltics. He's vice president of Bountiful Children's Foundation, which helps feed children and provide nutritional supplements for hungry and malnourished children around the world. And right now they're in 20 countries, I believe, with over 400 volunteers. And he and his wife also founded Fast Forward for the Planet, which joins people of all faiths to get together, or join together, I should say, in fasting 2 meals per month and donating the money toward the future of the planet. Does that one sound familiar? Well, this goes outside of just the LDS tradition and unites faiths everywhere. So it's a great cause, and glad to have Bob with us today. Okay, Bob, thanks, and welcome to the program. Glad to have you join me today.
Thank you, Devery. Pleasure to be here.
And I was thinking about it, just wondering how long it was I've actually known you. I remember when I first started working on my dialogue history, when it was just a classroom project back in 1994, I called you from a phone booth when you were in the mission presidency. And where were you, Russia or somewhere like that?
It was in the we were first in the St. Petersburg, Russia mission, and then in the newly formed Baltic States mission. It was just organized shortly after we got there.
Oh, okay. Well, I was determined to do a great job on the paper, so I want it was, since you were an editor of Dialogue from about 1970 to 76, I guess.
Yeah,
I
that's
definitely.
let me just say, Devery, that your history was extremely valuable and very professional. I have returned to it a number of times.
Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate that. And your years were very important, and there was a lot that happened then. And I remember how the fun I had researching and writing about your period, editing Dialogue. So I've known you to some extent since then, and then I worked at Sunstone for a while back in 2000, 2001, and got to know you better then when you would come to the office periodically for board meetings and that. So yeah, it's been a pleasure knowing you all this time, going on 30 years, I guess, so since I first
Yeah.
contacted you. All right. Well, I wanted to talk to you because you edited a couple of books. Well, you've done at least 4 books for us, maybe more. But the 2 I'm talking about today are Why I Stay and Why I Stay Too. So there was a sequel to this first one that came out just a couple of years ago. And the reason I want to talk about this because the title of the book is also the title of a session at the Sunstone Symposium. And with Sunstone coming up in a few weeks, there'll be another session with people presenting on Why I Stay this year. So I thought it'd be a good time to talk about this. Now, these feature, the books feature papers presented at Sunstone over the years. You kind of took the best of, or at least as many as you could put in one volume at a time, to publish those papers. And I'm sure they've been very helpful to a lot of people. And I want to talk to you about that. But first, I want to just talk about how this session began at Sunstone and what was your vision for it?
I didn't really begin it. I it started, some years ago, and there are two sessions of Sunstone that have been popular, very popular over the years. The ones that have attracted the most people. One of those, the first was Pillars of My Faith, that when has I think well over 100 people uh, presented at Pillars of My Faith over a long period of time, and then Why I Stay, which I think became popular at a time when the question of staying was more important, because many people were either leaving or considering leaving or wondering about staying. And so those were organized, I think, by Toby Pingree. And then Toby, uh, uh, maybe he wasn't the first, but he did it for a number of years, then turned it over to Dan Wotherspoon, who is responsible for choosing the people who participate. And as I've gone to those every year, I just found them so meaningful. So many people giving serious thought and thoughtful seriousness about the question of why they have decided to say, or the wrestling with that. The difference between the first volume and the second volume was that, in I think something like maybe 8 or 9 years between, maybe 10 between the two volumes, is that a number of the people who presented after the first volume ended up not staying. And so there are people that I really wanted to use who had given really terrific Sunstone presentations, but they had made the decision between that presentation and when I was editing the book not to stay. So it was a very different experience editing the two volumes. Uh, Fortunately, there were a number of really wonderful essays to choose from. And these were, again, if you look at the volume of, or the catalog, I should say, of people who have expressed that. And then in the second volume, talking to people at Sunstone, I mean, at Signature, I noted that there were not very many people. It was not as diverse as I had wanted it to be, and I think as Signature thought it might be. So we added some other voices. We commissioned a couple of people, Gloria Pack for one, and Kimberly Titer for another, an Asian and a Black, to begin to reach out to include a greater diversity of um, voices for staying. And I really am pleased that we did that because I think the second volume has that richness of diversity.
All right, yeah, and I really enjoyed the second one as well. Enjoyed the first too, but it was nice seeing Kimberly in there. I'd come to admire her over the last few years, and so she really stood out to me when I saw that she was in there. So both books have done pretty well for us over the years. It tells us that there's a lot of interest in this subject. And I was just wondering if you've received feedback from people who've read these or found the essays helpful on their own spiritual journeys.
Yes, over the years I have people who contact me from time to time saying that they either read the book or read a particular essay in one of the books that was very helpful to them. I think that that is so today in today's church because there are a lot of people are what I call negotiating their relationship with the church. Uh, People who I talk in the I think in the introduction of the second volume that there are, and I use uh, David Brooks' essay on the edge of the inside, which Chris Kimball has used. The inside of the edge. His new book on that. But I loved the idea when I read Brooks' essay because it was clear to me that there are people who are right at the center of the church. They're at the core of the church. They don't have doubts or issues. They are simply there and see their life in a kind of wholehearted devotion, unquestioning devotion for many people. There are other people who are on what Brooks calls the out the outside of the organization, and they also have very clear position. They have left. They have reasons for leaving. They're very comfortable in having left, and and Brooks talks about both kinds. The ones at the very center are the defenders of the faith, or the defenders of our organization. The ones on the outside are the critics. And then he said there are those who are at the edge of the inside. And when I read that essay, I said, this finally describes me. I am a person who is deeply devoted to the church, committed to it from the time I first heard about it when I was 10 years old. And uh, and yet a person who has been engaged intellectually and spiritually in the church from the time I was a student at BYU and began to have questions and began to read other things and to wonder about things. And so that being at the edge of the inside gives you a perspective, one that allows you to be thoughtful and critical in a careful way and a thoughtful way when you find it necessary because you're committed to something which is uh, a community of believers and thinkers that also includes a community of doubters, a community of people who are run across a broad spectrum. And to me, I think Jesus draws a large circle. I think you read his parables; they're reaching out to pull people in. They're reaching out to say, "You belong. Come and follow me, and I will give you rest." And so I think there is a discipleship that is reflected in the question of uh, why I stay. I'm working on a book on latter day discipleship, and it includes a lot of those principles and ideas and thoughts that come out of the people who thoughtfully consider why I stay. And one of the interesting things is that almost all of the people who have contributed to these volumes have wrestled with the big problems, wrestled with the issues of race, diversity, of LBQT, all of the alphabets, LGBT,
LGBTQ. Yeah.
uh, who wrestle with the question of the intellect. It's interesting. Gloria and I teach the 9-year-olds, 8, 9-year-olds in primary, and we have every once in a while we have what we call "Ask Me Any Question Sunday," and just says to the kids, the week before, next week we're going to do Ask Me Any Question, and so if you have questions, come and we'll talk about them. We did this a couple of weeks ago, and one of the 9-year-olds, super bright young girl, said, "Who's right, religion or science?" I said, "Boy, that's a great question. Let's talk about it." So asking questions, it seems to me, is what Jesus did. Is what God says. Come, let us reason together. Uh, I I say to the primary student, one of the same girl said, "Everybody thinks I ask too many questions," and I said, "Every sincere question is a good question," which is how I felt in my university classes. There's not a bad question. There may be sincere and insincere questions, but any question that is really seeking for an answer is a good question. And there are many questions that God knows and Jesus knows that we have questions if we're half alive and half awake in the church. Um, there's Christian, what's his name, the poet, just has have his book over there. Christian Wyman uh, says, if the church you belong to at 50 is the same church you belong to at 15, something's wrong. And the church is a an environment. It's a school for evolution, and God calls us to evolve. And I think one of the things about the Why I Stay essays is that they are essays in evolution. They're essays in people wanting to learn, wanting to know, wanting to grow, wanting to become more spiritual, more devoted, but also more thoughtful in their faith. And so I love that idea that almost every one of them, in fact, I would say every one of them, has evolved to a place and they're not content with where they are. They know that evolution is an ongoing thing, that it's an eternal thing. And so I think one of the great things about the restoration is Joseph Smith's vision of an evolving church, a restoration that is not an event, but it's a process. And that not only is it a process, but the really wonderful thing is it's a process that invites us to participate in the process. So that in our wards, in our stakes, in our callings, we are we are called to evolve. We are called to be better. We are called to make our ward or our branch, our district or our stake better by our callings, by our service, by our love, by our thinking. And so the church is a place of evolution, and that, in a sense, is the whole plan of salvation. My friend Carl Keller, who died early of AIDS many, many, many years ago, said, risk is the only kingdom. Well, risk isn't the only kingdom, but any kingdom worth its name has to involve risk. And discipleship is risk. And the whole center, the biggest risk in eternity is God giving us free agency. There was no guarantee that we would act nobly or act according to the light we have. But God trusted that we would be given that chance. So I see the church as a place of evolution, and the things that some people question why I go to Sunstone. I go to Sunstone for a lot of reasons. To begin with, when Peggy Fletcher and Keeney came to see me at my dialogue office when I was at UCLA, they said, we're starting a new magazine. It's going to be different than dialogue. And I said, great, tell me about it. So they told what they were doing. I said, it's a terrific idea. What are you going to call it? I think they said, well, we're thinking of Whetstone. And I said, and I just published an issue of dialogue that had on the cover was a sunstone from the Nauvoo temple. And I said, why don't you think about another name? And they said, what? I said, think about Sunstone. And a couple of years ago, I wrote an essay why the sun and the stone are such great images. There's a foundation there of solidity, but there's that light which is always shining, asking us to see more and to be more. And so I know that there are people who, either for institutional reasons or what, either don't go or feel they can't go to dialogue. But I've got an essay coming out in the next issue of Sunstone magazine called "Would Jesus Go to Sunstone?" And this is, and my argument is this: Jesus went to the sunstone of his day. He went to where people were having discussions. He went to where people were sinners. He went to where people were wanting to follow him and wanting to leave him. He went wherever people were alive and engaged or willing to engage. And so I've been critical of Sunstone over the years because I think sometimes there are things that are that for me are reached too far to the edge. But I also recognize that there are people who come there for that. But I also know there are people who come there because they're looking for confirmation. They're looking for validation. So these books, Why I Stay, the new series that Gloria and I hope to edit that Signature has approved, is the other really popular session of Sunstone, Pillars of My Faith, that goes back almost to the beginning of Sunstone. And the same when I was reading these and going to these sessions of Why I Stay, I thought, these need to be in a bigger audience. People need to have these, and that's why I decided to collect them and publish them. And that's the same reason I've had for maybe 30 years the idea of publishing Why I Stay pillar or what the pillars of my faith. So we hope to be doing that.
Yeah, and that was a question I was going to ask about that, because I noticed that the session's been revived and is going to be
We
back on the
asked for it to
program
be revived.
this
Yeah,
year.
it was so. One of the reasons why is Gloria and I started reading these essays. We say, wow, there are a lot of people who have not had a chance to present a Sunstone session or presented a session on the pillars of their faith. As I look back over the list of people, Davis Bitton and Leonard Arrington, and even a number of people from BYU who gave pillars of my faith. If you look at the list of pillars of my faith presenters, there are the people who, over a period of 40 years, have been dynamically involved in the life of the church. And those pillars, those reasons, really, like Why I Stay, it gives people what really is it that upholds my faith? What are the pillars that sustain why I'm here? If Jesus is the foundation of the church, then there must be pillars on that foundation that uphold the house of faith. And those over the years have been just wonderfully thoughtful, beautiful, moving, inspiring spiritual essays. So, with as with the essays from Why I Stay, we're sending those to the people who wrote them and presented them. In the case, a number of people have passed on, and so we've contacted and are in the process of contacting the relatives who have permission to publish their essays and editing them. But we're really excited about the project. I think there are uh, 2 or 3 volumes of really solid, thoughtful expressions of people talking about their faith. And there's a lot of variety. It's really interesting when you take that metaphor. I think Mary Bradford called hers "Pillows of My Faith."
Right, I remember that. I remember reading that. It was published.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I remember just some of the ones that I attended. My first Sunstone Symposium was in 1990 in Lavina. Fielding Anderson did hers then, which I've quoted from that one a million times.
yeah,
And then 10 years later, when I was chair of the symposium in 2000, Carolyn Pearson spoke that year, and hers was
Carolyn's,
just fabulous. And
yeah,
hers
beautiful.
I've remembered really well over the years.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it, but if Peggy hadn't come along and talked to you, we'd be going to the Whetstone Symposium in a few weeks, I guess, right? So,
Well, I hope they would have rethought that. They were just thinking about it, and young people with a great idea. They came to see me, and I was in a place where I had received some good essays from uh, and dialogue, and uh, I wasn't going to be able to use them, so I said, "Here's some things you can consider."
oh well, good.
So,
Yeah, it's got a good ring to it. So,
yeah,
um, and it's interesting because as you talked about uh, just your own journey as well, and how the things you've learned over the years as you've been involved in Why I Stay, and just reconciling faith, as we talk about faith and science, and uh, just wanting the church to become intellectually meaningful to people who are trying to stay in. I imagine your years with dialogue gave you a big taste of all of that. I don't know if so much with the people that presented or that submitted papers that you published, but maybe the audience, the subscribers. Uh, how did your years at Dialogue kind of prepare you, or I guess bring you along on the journey towards
it was,
why I stay in those interests?
it was a very exciting time for me. I loved Gene and loved his work and was going from UCLA up to Stanford periodically to work with him and other people. And then when he left to go to Minnesota, asked me if I would be the next editor, and I was extremely pleased, but also very humbled because I realized what a big job it was, and it was held together kind of with scotch tape and string for a couple of years as we were trying to build the audience. But part of what excited me about it, Devery, was getting things in that just spoke to me. Uh, uh, Lester Bush's article, when that came across my desk, I read it and was just so inspired, so astonished that it clarified for the first time, like so many people, I had wrestled with that issue and had tried to work out some kind of accommodation for it, never really being at peace with it. And when I read Lester's article, I just thought, my heavens, this is such an inspired work. I just finished reading Greg Prince's uh, uh, article submitted to Dialogue, which is under review for Dialogue, on the Lester Bush and the publishing of the essay. And you know, I I thought it was a model of scholarship, but he was a model scholar. He had sent
Mm.
he gave me the submitted the article with a thick volume of all of his research,
Right.
which
It
he
was
had
like 400 pages. Yeah.
which he had also given to the church and had sent to them. And it was it, deciding to publish Lester's article was one of the most, in a sense, harrowing, but also, I think, courageous things that we did as as editors, as an editorial staff. But there were so many things. It was exciting to be getting all the. I felt in a way like I felt the first time I picked up the first issue of Dialogue. I was in graduate school. I sat down and read it from cover to cover, and I felt there's a place for me in this church.
Yeah.
I felt there was then, but Dialogue, that first issue of Dialogue was so thoughtful and so important and so inspiring that
Yeah.
I felt I'm home. So being asked to edit Dialogue was a real honor. And then when I was receiving all of the things, I realized not long ago that 50 years ago, uh, 50 years ago, 50 years ago, I published the first essay by a Latter day Saint homosexual that was published in the church. It was called Anonymous.
Right. I
Uh,
remember that. Reading
in
that.
those days, it was, not, not safe to put your name on something like that. But it was a beautiful essay that just was a cri de coeur in a way. And that probably set me on the track. I've been working with the LGBT community for 50 years. And that essay really spoke to my heart, as did when I was a bishop and had a number of gay, lesbian, Latter day Saints in my ward. I was being schooled in what I felt was an extremely important part of the restoration. So it was a great adventure to be there and to have the privilege of turning it over to Mary.
When you talk about the articles that have been in dialogue, whether it's been history, whether it's been the personal essays, whether it's poetry or fiction, all the stuff that has resonated with people, that stuff that they wouldn't have or couldn't have read elsewhere. I was telling someone just recently that the two people I think about who left this world too early, and the stuff that I know that there would have been so many great things they would have contributed. I think of all the music we didn't get because of John Lennon's murder. And I think of all the essays and probably books too that we didn't get because of Gene's death. When I think of the last 22 years now, the articles and essays he would have written, it just, blows my mind to think we would have had those. There's no question we would have had those. And we were gypped out of that. So,
And we would be so much richer. Gene was, I've just finished along with Thomas Judge Griffith and Brent Rushforth. We've just edited 45 essays as a tribute to Gene. It's
Oh,
called
wow.
Remembering Gene, How He Changed Our Lives. And, I was just privileged. Gene was my best friend, and we talked almost weekly. We shared essays that we sent to each other to read and edit, and his voice is sorely missed. I've done, I think, 3 issues in the past 20 years called Remembering Gene, and there's a session this time called Remembering Gene, where there will be some of the essays from that volume that will be excerpts from them will be read.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
great. Yeah, I noticed that in the program. So, you also talked about another session. I guess for the last several years, I've just been at the signature table at Sunstone and haven't really attended outside the table. So I wasn't aware of the session called Returning, which I guess you said has been done at the symposium. Not
We,
this year, I
we,
guess, but you've done it in the past.
we,
This is people who return to the church after having left. Is that right?
yeah, I started it last year, and I felt that also was the story. We don't hear very often of that story. We have much more. There are many more stories about leaving, but coming back is, it is uh, my favorite parable of all of Jesus' parables is the prodigal son. I think it is just an incredibly beautiful uh, essay or parable. In fact, I recently to the primary class, I say, what would you do if you had a son who spent all of his money and wasted it and went away and then wanted to come back? And these kids were pretty harsh about that. Well, no. And then I said, let me tell you the story that Jesus tells. And one of the beautiful things about that parable, and the Jewish midrash has a midrash on it, that the father goes out every morning looking to the horizon to see if his son has come home year after year, year after year. And then one morning he goes out, he's a king, he goes out and the son of the king is gone. He goes out and sees his son and runs toward him and embraces him. And that uh, that idea of somebody coming back, it's not easy to come back, I think, but so in this, the essay that, or the session we did last year, Tom Christofferson, uh, Rod Holland, who is the brother of primary president Susan Porter, he was in our bishopric 20 years ago and went inactive, and then Lori and I were actually called to be his ministering brother and sister, and we started meeting him and found just this remarkable person whose reason for leaving was thoughtful, not despiteful, not angry, but just and so he made the return and became part of our bishop went to the bishopric after 20 years of being out of the bishopric. It's a beautiful story. Then there was a woman named Hatch who had been in a polygamous marriage and who had felt she was part captive of a cult, and so she told her story of returning. I wanted to do it again this year, but it wasn't accepted. But I'll propose it again for future Sunstones because I think it's a compelling story, and it's part of the whole gospel narrative. In a way, I think one could say, Devery, that I think I just reread Susan Hinckley's beautiful essay in the second volume. She says people at church said something like, "Are you in the process of leaving?" And she said, "No, I'm in the process of staying." And so I think
I
that
guess it is a process.
yeah, that we're all in process in a way in our faith, and we there are things we find that compel us to be there on Sundays, and sometimes things that can say, "Why am I there?" And so the why I stay is I think Elder Holland, in a conversation with him, he said something about we ought to change the title of it, uh, something more definitive, like "I'm staying," uh, or something like that. But the reasons for staying uh, are are good. As I say in the second volume, there are sound reasons for staying and sound reasons for leaving. I know people who have left, and I can't quarrel with their reasons for leaving. I try to give them my reasons for staying, but some people, it's too painful for them to stay. A mother who has a trans child who finds that child mistreated at church, a woman who has been divorced and is kind of marginalized at church. Sometimes people don't find the church a habitable place. They don't find it a friendly place. And some people leave for a month or a week or a year or longer, and then some find their way back.
Yeah. And I remember years ago, I think, I don't think I attended this session, but I listened to the tape. It was one you gave on, and I don't remember what year this was. Maybe you know offhand, but it was called What's Right with the Church. And I remember
Mm-hmm.
Patrick McKenzie responded to your paper, and you
Yeah,
were just basically talking about, I think, a lot of things that get overlooked by a lot of people. That, I remember Patrick felt it was nice to hear that kind of positive stuff about the church at Sunstone because he felt it hadn't been there for
yeah,
a while. I don't know if it's been 20 years now or if it was pre-internet.
probably about that long.
But I just wonder now. I imagine, because I've even back then, uh, you know, maybe a lot. It was nice to get a reminder that there about positive things that get overlooked. But I imagine in the 20 years since a session like that, I imagine it's even worse now as far as stuff that gets overlooked or the message that hey, there is still something good here for a lot of people. Do you think it's gotten harder to give that kind of a talk, or not? Maybe not harder to give the talk, but that the situation has changed to where a talk like that is maybe needed more now than it even was then.
Well, somebody asked me, why don't you give a talk? What's wrong with the church? And I said, I could give that. But there are a lot of people, in a sense, giving that talk. But I say, Devery, I distrust two kinds of people, or four kinds, really: those who never think and those who only think, those who never feel and those who only feel. A religion, a faith that is dynamic, involves uh, uh, acknowledging what's right and acknowledging what's wrong. Someone said the other day, there was just discussion about the 100 to 150 billion dollars, and someone was saying, defending that. Someone else said, "Well, you're being critical of the prophet." And I said, anybody who knows church history knows that you can be totally uncritical or totally critical. A thoughtful disciple is both. To look at times in which you say, as many people did for a very long time, this withholding the priesthood from blacks is not right. I can't comport that with my heart, with my faith. But for me, I was dedicated to staying in the church and working for change. And that's been true whether it's related to women's issues, LGBT issues, uh, the whole environmental thing that Gloria and I have a new foundation called Fast Forward for the Planet that is dedicated to bringing all the fates of the world together to fast two meals a month for the environment, for the planet. Just beginning, but
Mm.
it's something that we feel the church could do a lot more. Church has recently hired somebody to be in charge of sustainability. That's wonderful. The church has just given a lot of water to the Great Salt Lake. So people who only see what's wrong with the church or only see what's right for the church never see the real church.
Right. And I think that's one of the nice things about a community like this is you can discuss those things. You can lay out your criticisms, your concerns, your experience. And as you mentioned, there are so many people with LGBTQ kids, parents, siblings, that church is very painful. And to just say, well, the Lord wants you there, just pray away your feelings and stuff. And those need to be validated because they're real concerns, they're real feelings, it's real pain. And so listening to the good, listening to the bad, and not being judgmental about it, it's nice to have a community where you feel like you can air those things and it's okay. And that's what I
Yeah,
like about this community.
I think of the good and try to make more of it. Think of the bad and try not to be part of it. For
Yeah,
me,
that's a great way to
uh,
be.
and so we can magnify the good of the church. We can address those parts of the church. I mean, I recently uh, was on a fireside with new book called "And They Had No Poor Among Them" by Ryan Ward, a Latter-day Saint from New Zealand, and he is, in a sense, calling the church to repentance over the fact that we have so many starving people. We have so many homeless people. We have so many people who are deprived and are lonely and lost. And the gospel calls us to that. That's what Jesus says, the least of these. And he wants us to see him as the transgender child at church, or as the child in Madagascar who doesn't have enough to eat, or as the whatever it is, whoever we see as least. Jesus calls us to do that. And this is why I think the gospel and the church is a rough instrument in the hands of the Lord. He wants us to make it a better instrument and calls us to do that. So that in her beautiful essay in Why I Stay, Molly Benyon asked Lowell Benyon, why should I stay? And he said, to serve and be served, to love and be loved. Those are wonderful reasons for staying. And so people who only go to be loved but don't go to love, or people who only go to be served and don't are missing half of what it means to have a dynamic faith and to be part of a dynamic church.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, it's great. And the foundation you've started sounds wonderful. So you've got a ton of work left to do in this world. So I think you're going to be around a while. And you're one of these that seems to kind of never age either. You seem to be the same person you were 30 years ago. So, uh,
Well, I've been blessed to be young by having been married to two wonderful women. My first wife, Ruth, who passed away 20 years ago, and my current wife, Gloria Gardner, to whom I was married 5 years ago. And they keep me young. And having between Gloria, between the two of us, we have 19 grandchildren, 10 children and 19 grandchildren, and they help keep us young. But the
yeah, and pretty
imagination,
busy too. So,
yeah, Christ invites us to use our imagination. Imagination is the greatest unused gift of the Spirit. If we use our imagination, we will have a dynamic faith and a dynamic church.
all right. Well, thanks so much, Bob. And I just want to remind everybody the two books that Signature published, Why I Stay and Why I Stay Too, uh, have a lot of these essays from the Why I Stay session that's given each year at the Sunstone Symposium, and hopefully there'll be more of those to come. There's certainly a lot more talks to listen to, and they're recorded, and so they're available. So to those that this appeals to, if you're have questions and a book like this would appeal to you, or the essays in here would, these are both in print, and Signature has them, and they're available wherever you can get Signature books, LDS
And,
books. And if they don't have it, you can order it. So,
and Signature has a lot of other wonderful books. One of the books that is out of print now is the one that Gene England and I edited, Reader's Book of Mormon, and the tribute to Gene that Signature published. Um, what was it called? A collection of essays.
proving contraries, I believe.
Proving Contraries,
Yeah.
a collection of essays in honor of Gene England.
Yes, all these are signature titles. And if if you come to Sunstone and see Bob there, he'll be happy to sign any of these books that we've published, and he'll be more than happy to do that. I assume that you will be.
Indeed,
All
indeed.
right. Well, Bob, look forward to seeing you there in a few weeks,
Thank you, Devery.
and thanks a lot for talking with me today. Really appreciate your time and appreciate the conversation.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good day. Thanks.